Folks, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show. As we wrap up another calendar year, music certainly has cumulative results, and musicians who create that music also have a cumulative effect as it relates to the Jake Feinberg Show because I'm able to continue to create these bridges of authentic musicians who are bringing light and love to this world. And that was recently, again, proven to me, being connected to my next guest through, um, a dear spirit, an angel, and Serena Gabriel, and then to not only connect with my guest and to just be sort of awed by his capacity to create continuously through a multitude of different instruments, to find out he was so beautifully connected to people from the brother and sisterhood that I've chronicled so much, people like Michael Shreve. Just sort of as I drove back to Tucson that day, it sort of reinstilled in me, the purpose of the path that I'm on, and kind of been high stepping ever since. Steve Roach, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you so much, Jake. And it's a noble, beautiful path that you're on, and that you're bringing all of us on.
Yeah, that's right. I tend to forget I'm bringing a lot of people along with me.
Completely so. And it's just the layers of inspiration and history that your incredible catalog of interviews holds is when I discovered it, a few years ago, before we came even close to talking. And I heard the John Abercrombie, the first interview there. That was really said so much about you, and why I'm so grateful to be speaking with you now.
The feeling's mutual. I wanted you to talk. I mean, do you think that there's validity to the idea that music has cumulative results? I mean, like for me, it's like, I mean, just using it interpersonally and my own connections. I meet Serena, then I wind up connecting with Michael Shreve, then I connect with you. I mean, to me, it's like, just from that elemental point of view, like it all leads up to the fact that we are now creating together, but the whole thing happened 10 years earlier. I wonder if that can speak for your music.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the creative life, and speaking to the path that I've been on for almost 40 years, and the blooming of music and collaborations, and the meeting of kindred spirits around the world, and performing around the world, and performing, a lot right here at home in Tucson. Beautiful always to do that. And the community that's here, the depth and richness of our community in Tucson, of course. But I mean, I was really thinking about this recently. I saw an interesting documentary on Sinead O'Connor that I didn't know much about her at a deeper level, but I just saw that on Showtime, and it was quite mind-blowing in terms of what formed her. And I felt certain parallels with what she was sharing early on, in that her undeniable need to express, in her case through voice and words, but was through, like, where music was really almost at like a therapeutic level. It was a need that just had to happen. And in that case, it is cumulative, in that over the years, music has really been my most reliable and unrelenting way of processing and growing as a person, and through sound and music. But it's really, it serves that purpose in my life. And that's why I feel certain people I still encounter are kind of bewildered on how can I create so much music, through the course of my life here. And but it's really, there's really no no other way to express that, other than that it's such a deep need to create every day, and to have this reflection, and to have this experience where, when you're working in the studio, or you're playing, just improvising, like I was just doing an hour ago in the live room that you saw here.
Right.
And so there's always this flow, but there's this, this continuously blooming sense of self, and this sense of questions that get answered without you really asking them, but they seem to come into focus through the process of creativity. That could be, art in any way that it takes form. But
Hmm.
in my case, the music and sound is that, that endless source of reflection and integration, and it's very cathartic, and it just has the full range of truth and beauty that we reach for in at the core of ourselves. And so,
You know, I it's really poetic. I curious about, I mean, because you have so much. I mean, a lot of people create a lot of music. You actually have put a lot out of it into the universe in a discography, prolific discography. I mean, a lot of cats will, they'll learn a couple of licks and some runs and some stuff, and then, they'll sort of beg, borrow, and steal, find their individual voice. How do you just, does the creative source come through you and it's almost like it was just, how have you not copied some riffs from, I mean, you have so much stuff, all of it is original. Did you ever find, how does improvisation come to you? Do you have a bag of licks, or is it just, you know, the dragon appears when the dragon appears?
well, that would be a really, a great romantic way to express that. I suppose that, like I hear a lot of musicians and creative people saying they just feel like it comes through you. And that is, that's a feeling that I feel if we're completely in the flow, there's that sense that it's coming through you, but there's a lot of homework that goes in before it just comes through you. There's a lot of endless hours and years and and dedication to study, and dedication to very conscious thought into the direction that you're going at any particular time. And then there's a certain, there has to be certain self-critical pieces there, so you're just not doing the same cool thing over and over again. And that there is, consistency in my music. Some critics of my music would say, well, that sounds like something you did 8 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 or 15. I mean, there is a voice that we speak with. When we learn to speak proficiently with this voice as an artist, then, that's a beautiful thing. I mean, that's when you hear the masters, Miles Davis and Coltrane or Klaus
Sure.
Schultz, or,
Yeah.
all these guys have all of these artists that you're inspired by. There's a voice there. And so, but through that voice, then there's, an awareness to keep infusing it with life and infusing it with the present awarenesses of things that you're learning, or the things that are coming to you while you're, deep in the flow. And, there was that recent quote I heard. I'm not sure where it could have even been through one of your interviews, but it was like, but, thought destroys flow.
Right.
And to a certain degree, there's aspects of that's really right on, especially in the flow of the moment. If you're overthinking it, you're getting hung up on thinking about what you did yesterday or the last time that you played that piece live or something, and you're trying to track your footsteps back, then that's just going to just tie you down. But
Well, can you talk about a specific example? I mean, where maybe earlier in your career, how you extended. I mean, I get the feeling you were always thirsting for more. But what was like the biggest challenge musically that you came up with? I remember talking to Ron Tutt, the great drummer for Elvis, and Jerry Garcia, among other people, Neil Diamond. And he said when reggae came along and that downbeat was on the 1 and 3 instead of the 2 and 4, it was very humbling. He really had to shed. And I realize we're talking about different genres of music and stuff, but was there something that were early in your career that where it dawned on you that you had to push yourself out of your comfort zone in order to increase vocabulary and not just rely on some cool, showy thing?
Right. That I would say in the early stages, in the very first like 4 years, where I was really drawn to the what's called the Berlin School, or the European electronic music that was born from Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, and what was all emerging out of that world, where they were moving away from their influence of Western music and just developing their own sound based on technology and based on their place on the planet and in the world. So, it was, as we talked earlier, I believe in the first interview, I talked about the influence of that music and from that part of the world, and how, unbelievably mysterious it was, while these guys were not so much older than myself, but just, in a whole other realm of culture and everything that's shaped them from, post World War II, being right there in Germany, all of those political pieces that were happening, all of that boils down into a kind of music that then inspired me tremendously, which was, using the sequencer, which creates the repetitive trance-like patterns that you would associate with synthesizer, the core of of one aspect of early electronic music.
Absolutely.
So that sound, when I first discovered it, and was able to get my hands on the instruments, and then just start learning those techniques and starting to make those techniques my own. And then, I soon realized, through whatever grace of consciousness that I was, tapping into, was that this is really something I love and I'm inspired by, and it's physically addicting, really, that quality of music. But it was like, this is I need to find where I'm at in the picture here, as a young guy growing up in Southern California and having a confluence of influences that would help shape, a form of expression that was completely mine, authentic to me, and to the pieces that of life beyond music that were so much informing me at that time. So, as an emerging young person who was really, again, not really fitting into an academic world, and not fitting into traditional music of the time, had zero interest in being in any kind of rock band or learning instruments that would gain entry into that world.
Let me ask you something. You talked about the use of synthesizers by Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, etc., that it was a movement away from the West. Would you say that it was like music from the cosmos? Was it really part of this world?
Yeah, I think, in knowing the interviews and the history with, like, those bands in particular, I mean, there was certainly the core of a lot of that was extreme psychedelic use at that time.
Right.
Like so many of the art forms and innovations were fueled by that kind of, expansive, expanding consciousness. And so at that time, I mean, you can only imagine being a young person whose parents just lived through World War II in Germany. And, there's some amazing documentaries on that aspect of what helped shape that music. But then there was the influence of Western music, but then that really wasn't, as I'm speaking about my experience, that wasn't something I feel that that was expressed from a German perspective, is they wanted to create their own form of music that had that visceral energy to it. There was the piece that was drawing me in towards the European, let's call it again the German school, was that there was still a rock element. There was, drums, and there were sometimes guitars, and then there was eventually a really driving pulse in there. And so, a great, I'd say a certain amount of that was definitely inspired by Pink Floyd. I mean, you'll hear Klaus and those guys talking about how Pink Floyd came in and really turned the lights on for them.
Who was their synthetic doctor musician in that band?
In what, Pink Floyd?
In Floyd, yeah.
Well, as a unit, I mean, Roger Waters, they had the VCS3, which was a little suitcase EMS synthesizer made in the UK that was
Wow.
like the original suitcase that Brian Eno used, and I actually had one of those. I was able to borrow from, I had this thing, and it was a friend of mine in San Diego's parents owned an AMC car lot. Those incredible, if you remember those, the Rambler and all those cars. That his parents had money, so he had money, and so he was able to buy these sophisticated, really rare European synths, for example. So I got my hands on that thing early on, but that when you see the making of Dark Side of the Moon, that particular synth with the little sequencer hooked up to it, that creates the patterns that you hear on Dark Side. So that the influence of again expanding consciousness through early LSD and all that good stuff. All of that was helping to take down the boundaries and to take people's imaginations and just push down on the plunger, and just blow everything up, mixed up with the
Socio-political move. Yeah,
the
totally.
whole political,
Yeah,
the whole climate of that whole incredible time that is, growing up in California, you had no inkling of nothing. We were living in paradise, in relationship to all of that. So, but we are getting this, constant influx from Europe of all of this music that's being influenced by, all sorts of things, but especially the expanding, like it did, of consciousness in the Bay Area and the bands that grew from that world. And
you would say that because Europe can be very diverse, there's a trance element. I mean, trance, that part of your whole, it's all trance in some ways. I just wonder the African element, if that is prevalent, if the experiences you've had with the motherland, if at all, or is that a place you would even desire to, considering that's where mankind is from?
You mean
Africa.
yeah, that aspect of that influence of
Well, and also I want you to break down this idea of, you're talking to somewhat, this is not really in my bag, but ultimately you differentiated from, like you said, I guess it would be called krautrock or industrial rock, where you had like guitars, drums. You still had some of that German rub, but then you took the synthesizers just sort of into a whole new level. But I mean, what is krautrock?
Well, that was a term that was coined, I think, in the UK, looking at, I don't know if you'd call it derogatory, but sauerkraut and the food of Germany, and it was some like
Krautrock.
maybe it was John Peel or somebody, just
Yeah.
there's like, they have some tongue-in-cheek version but then you had Amandul and Can, and
Sure.
there's just endless German bands that blew up at that time, and record labels were supporting all of that, German labels, and then Virgin Records came through with that, and then so I mean it was absolutely a revolution of music that was being propelled through this piece we spoke to about culture, and then the mind expanding piece, and then the restless, like wanting to define a new identity through sound and music culturally for yourself.
Yeah, you use the word mysterious. You use that word as far as like it was mood music too. It was very moody and
Yeah,
as
there was
opposed.
for
Yeah,
me, and again, there was a sense of the origin of where's this, what's generating, where did this
right.
music come from? Because if you go back to the mid 70s, and then you compare that to what was being served up on radio in America, it's like it's not from another, like it's not from outer space or from some cosmic faraway place. It's like it's a parallel world, but it's like it was so rich and so full of creativity and innovation and a depth of many cultures that were already coming together I would sense at that time. So the mystery was really this mysterious piece that some Klaus Schulze. I mean, this name sounds like some guy that's been around forever. It's like
he's from another century or something.
yeah, or it's like Richard Wagner's,
Yeah, right.
stepbrother or something.
Yeah, totally.
And so, all of that stuff, it was part of the formative years, but at a certain point, I mean, I almost can feel like the day that aha moment came to me with after a certain amount of maybe 2 or 3 years of having the instruments and some of the same instruments that Klaus had, and then feeling like, I mean, I'm here and I live for this experience of being in the desert and the visceral influences of that. That was my paradigm shifter. I didn't have to, I wasn't living through post World War II. I was, my dad and families around me had something to do with, World War II, serving in the service or something, but it was all very, very much removed from the safety and the kind of perfect, beautiful lifestyle of SoCal, Southern California. So, but I was aware of that juxtaposition. But what really became very, very, like a calling was, I'm tapped into this expansive feeling here, and I have these instruments that are. It's like having raw paints, and you can choose to paint any kind of image with that. And so, for me, it was really I'm on this calling to express, that expansiveness that we spoke on the first round of our interview. And that feeling was like connection to my place, on the planet, and my place from, an artistic, spiritual, I guess you'd say, connected place. The essence of all of that was really like, this is really a calling to express that. And that's when, my first album Now and then Traveler were still expressing aspects of my European influences, but the piece I was already breaking away from was doing shorter pieces. I was making these statements that were, 7-8 minutes long, or sometimes maybe shorter, where the pieces that were coming from Europe at that time, from Germany, the German school, which is what I like to refer to it as, is, they were long flowing spaces that, would come from that kind of pushing the boundaries and being in a highly, expanded state. And so for me, the idea of doing and expressing these concise pieces that would have, a beginning and a middle and an end, perhaps, or it would just be a space and a place that would drop you into an experience, and then you would leave that, and then you'd go to the next place. That's why my album called Traveler was really speaking to that quality of moving through these different worlds, but moving through them more, and more in a succinct experience, rather than taking each piece and having it be 30 or 40 minutes long,
right,
which would come later, and which is coming now. I mean, I'm really just we were prepping for this interview, and I just have a new double album that I've been working on ferociously, and just really like 45 minutes ago just finished the second disc, which is over one single piece that's 60 minutes long.
Wow.
With different movements in it and all of that. So but for a certain period there, the whole taking and putting those inspirations into my world, and then moving towards creating shorter pieces that would weave together to create a whole was really, a big piece that was really very conscious to me. While at the same time, though, I have to say, I would be creating these long form immersive spaces that would conjure up this feeling of being drifting, in the desert realms, or in, some kind of space where you're only embraced with what happens when you're, out in a natural environment with the sounds that are occurring there, the soundscape of nature, you might think of. But so that I was taking cues from that. But again, the experience of the music itself was really also tapped into, I was already moving towards meditation and yoga and that sort of thing. Didn't have anything necessarily to say, well, that's another product of Southern California, but it was certainly a product of the late 60s and just everything that was emerging and blooming on the planet. I mean, in Europe or in, Ohio or parts of Ohio, I would say, I guess, but, San Diego, Southern California, sure. Bay Area, all of that, sort of thing was just, it was in the atmosphere, and it was, it was just part of it was just a beautiful melding reality of all of these new pieces of information that when your consciousness and your sense of discovery is so voracious, and you start taking all those things in and making and interweaving those into your own experience, then this is, you're talking to, someone that has created, this is what you get, this kind of thing.
Do you believe that the techniques that you kind of, when you first picked up some of those early models, synthesizer, but you were figuring out techniques, you get your chops together.
Yeah.
The certain Steve Roach techniques, that not necessarily patented, but they're yours. Have they lent themselves to you now being able to create a 60-minute piece of, creation? I mean, have those techniques lent themselves to the ability to elongate and have, like, a 60-minute piece?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, from the late 70s, which when I, was able to get my hands on the first early ARP and Moog synthesizers. And out of that, the experiments come, and the worlds that you start to, the way it is, I'm sure now for young people getting any kind of, analog gear that's now completely
sure
in full bloom.
Sure.
So, I mean, you start developing, like we spoke of a voice, of a quality that is expressing something from deep within, and it's something that you can continue to evolve and develop, and that's, if you're playing, saxophone, trumpet, guitarist, ARP synthesizer, Sawinall had a totally unique voice.
Sure.
He played the same instruments that I play. And his whole thing was because the ARP 2600, you could invert the voltage on the keyboard, and he would have two of those ARP 2600s, and he would play and invert the keyboard so that it was going backwards. When you were playing up, the notes were actually going down. So
that is ridiculous.
And it's
so that was during like the Weather Report kind of era.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and he would, I mean, imagine you're taking your hands and playing them to the center, and he had to keep one of, the keyboards are inverted, so that basically just that. I mean, instead of, as you're playing up the keyboard, the notes are going down in pitch. And so it just, it's a good example of how you can use the instruments to invent techniques and forms of expression that are unique to each and every one of us. And so for me, the big piece here that completely is alive, like it's, more than ever, just as much as any other time, is the piece I just spoke to you about. called The Knowing Place, disc 2 of my new album that's coming
Yeah.
in March, called The Rest of Time. And the breathing aspect of my harmonic movement in with the voice, the chords that I invent and create are just unique to the way I hear. And then the way those chords are then articulated, played, and the quality of space, of literal space between the notes, is really, part of my, it's a big piece that I first discovered, had not heard it anywhere, but that came from the epiphanies we've been speaking to about the environmental influence of space and environment and desert and silence that lives in a real place, and then having that sense of what comes between sounds. Then there's this silent space, and it's so much energy there. There's so much that pulls you in. And so that's when I first developed that sense of the breathing aspect in electronic music, which you're not playing an instrument like a sax or a wind instrument of any kind, a flute. You're having to be aware that if you're wanting to have that kind of expression, for me, it became, well, I'll create that sense of playing an instrument, a breath activated instrument, but I'll be playing it with my hands, and I'll be breathing while I'm playing the instrument and putting the breath into the way I'm playing that instrument, meaning the synthesizer, and playing, chord progressions, and then having a larger span of space between the chords. And then
Mm.
I would start to feel more and more this feeling that occurs when you have that space. It's the same place you get in doing breath, meditation, and using, breath as a way to get really into the stillness of the moment. And then you start expanding that space between the breath. So it's a big piece of that just is alive in my music all the way to, it's there. It's one of the major pieces in my toolbox of all the things that I've learned and that I continue to put together. And so these days, that quality of breathing, the breathing chords, which are on this piece that I just finished here about an hour ago. There's also over the years, there's this harmonic expansion, that happens, this development of adding and creating more colors, and creating more dissonance and more consonants and more spaces in between those two places. And that's what I love, is creating these harmonic soundscapes that have this quality that's impossible to, there's no real words for it. There's not a language for it. And that's what I feel so drawn to when I'm creating the atmospheric soundscape pieces, are these landscapes that that word liminal is a very popular word now, but it's that place that's kind of in between the worlds, and you can't really describe it, and you just know when you're there, and there's something slightly
How do you spell that word?
liminal, Liminal, I think.
Wow. I'm not hip to that. I love that.
No, the liminal, like my album Be Curious really is just, but if you look that word up, it's one of the more popular words in searches right now.
Wow.
And I'm seeing more music with names of using liminal as a title. And so there's something that word also speaks to in this kind of suspended state of time and life that we're in right now. There's something, it's like when you go, I think the one sort of simple description of it is when you're in a place, and it's a place that's used or it's experienced in a certain way, but you're in it and it's not being utilized in that way. Like you go into a expansive stadium and there's not a single person in there.
Right.
And so you're getting that feeling of being somewhere, and you get that from maybe, I get it from when I went to Australia and I was in these sacred sites and with, Aboriginal rock art that very few people had seen, and you're standing there and you're seeing the stones on the ground where the pestles where they were grinding up the ochre rocks to paint on the walls, and it's just sitting there and no one's touched it in, you know, thousands and thousands of years, and you're standing there and you're having a relationship with it. And so, you know, there's that aspect of why I think we're a lot of us are drawn to what you would call a sacred space, or a place where life was once flourishing and it's no longer there now.
Hmm.
Or, you know, in our culture now, you have these states that we're experiencing as, you know, individually and culturally, because of how, what a strange world we're living in right now. So there's kind of this, you know, there's a liminal aspect, I think, all around us, you know.
I mean, isn't there something to be said also? It just dawned on me because you're waxing poetic. It's like here you have, you're going to these indigenous Aboriginal sites and taking in and feeling the energy of life in its former context hundreds of years ago. And the biggest issue today, and obviously your music is sort of an expression, not against it, but in contrast, is just, I mean, we plant a seed, we don't even give it a week to grow. We plant another seed, then we plant another seed, then we plant another seed. There's no time for the roots to really develop. So we live in this very transient time, yet the cosmos is filled with the essence of life and pulse from millions of years
Yeah,
ago.
right.
So
I mean,
and we're like when I was coming up as a young wet behind the ears. I mean, we had a landline telephone. We weren't there was I mean computers were for word processing. And now we're at a point now where, you know, it's so transient and fleeting in contrast with what we know and what you've witnessed and can feel. So I just feel like that's you talk about this strange time. It's like this. It's pretty pronounced in terms of the polar extremes. You know.
well, yeah, and it's so, you know, you talk about immersive. I mean, I love immersive experiences, but the immersive nature of our relationship to time right now, because of the immediacy at a given second, you hold
Mm,
it in your hand, you have a computer that's way more powerful than what put man on the moon, and you're dialing up TikTok, you know, looking at videos clips that are hitting millions and millions of people, you know. And
right.
so, but it's not like, you know, I mean, that's just creativity. That's like in the evolution of our intelligence, and the de-evolution on what might be viewed as from some people. But um
I
it's
just
just
feel like the idea of like you can go back. I mean, this is something we haven't really touched on, but it's just the idea that like there was something at one point called artist development.
totally.
It would take a few like the companies would understand that it would take a couple of albums before they might get a radio friendly hit, but they stayed with that. It wasn't so one and done moving on. There's no time for any real roots.
Oh, you're
If you can, like, that's really why I start in some ways. It's like I wanted there to be this sense of lineage that was so deep that it would just be an art, a treasure trove of just sort of roots at the core, And I feel like your music, like, I mean, a lot of that visual stuff that I saw at the burger, it felt like atmospheric roots. Sometimes it's deep, it's elongated, it can get gnarly, it can open up, but it's all
yeah.
there and it's tough and it's not just gonna, poof in the wind. You get people. My point is that it took a while. Also, you wouldn't just get crowned to be a band leader if you had no experience as an accompanist. So you just had a lot of people that were put in positions before they really had a chance to actually go through the process. And like you said, we're always in a rush now. Everything
Right.
needs to happen. Yes, 10 minutes ago. And that's not how anything quality actually happens.
Right, and the living with the whole process with,
Right.
I mean, for me, the holy grail was eventually I would reach a point to where my music was worthy of putting out on vinyl.
Right.
And that took about 5 years, and it was, I mean, it was really like that was a incredible initiation at that point because of being having grown up in record stores and just the reverency you would have for release for albums and the connection you would have to the music, and then
The listening parties you'd have, you'd go get the album, you go to your friends, immediately, maybe in your, I don't know, I mean, but there were concept albums and there was a lot of communal listening to music. People didn't have earbuds in.
right, yeah, no, it was like it was a ceremony that you would have, and then for me it was like no speaking. I mean, you put the album on and we're
I
you know
dig, man. Deep listening.
yeah, you get scowled at, and it didn't even but no one, everybody understood that anyway. But
Right.
I mean, I think that's the beauty of vinyl coming back around is that, you know, if we have kids, those who have kids, and then they want to, or whoever missed out, or they want to get that experience back, that vinyl brings back the ceremony of listening, of
Absolutely. I can see it. I can see it with my daughters. You can put on Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. You play the whole thing all the way through one side.
yeah,
And so, but I just going back to this idea of approaching something in a Zen. I don't know what the right word is, but 60 minutes. I forget the name of the piece now, but the one you just created. I mean, that is patience personified. And you know, I also think that there's probably stuff that you, uh, well, I mean, talk a little bit about how much, what kind of new vocabulary you feel like you're incorporating into your music now.
right. Well, the constant and steady evolution of the technology that I'm always drawn to, that's a constant beautiful thing that you can experiment and audition and bring new instruments into the fold, which then creates inspiration for whole new directions in music. So I mean, it's the what we have now is just mind blowing. I mean, the number of choices that we have, the instruments that are being produced and created and released, constantly. It's beyond overwhelming. So you have to have a certain, a sense of discipline in terms of what you're drawn to as an instrument. I mean, the guitar, we know that there's still some of the most sought after guitars you're going to find that were made before 1960.
Mm,
And,
absolutely.
and in this case, I mean, I have a variety of vintage synthesizers here that were, from the dawn of the early days, and they're still functional. And I keep them alive and well, and they appear in my music. But then I'm also bringing in, new instruments and auditioning, and it often takes 3 to 6 months before the audition is over to see if it's going to stay or not. But in terms of the evolution of my music, and I've always for years, let's just say not always, the first probably well up through Dreamtime, that would be the first 8 years, it was 100% synthesizers. And then once I started opening up to acoustic instruments, and that's when in the mid 80s the world music was really exploding, and I was already being drawn, of course, to the didgeridoo and Indian music and that sort of thing, and at that time. But eventually I would start introducing more and more acoustic instruments in there, and then that led me to that whole period where I worked with Jorge Reyes, the late Mexican, uh, you know, fantastic musician from Mexico
Right, right.
that blended, you know, a bunch of the electronics along with all of his pre-Hispanic instruments. And so that whole period of my music was, you know, I really brought that whole sound through when it was just right at the dawn of occurring. So what was,
Can you talk about going to Australia? That was something I wanted to mention in the first interview because did you feel like it was important to learn? Did you feel like you wanted to actually get your hand, your literally your arms around the didge yourself, or did you go there with the intention to record your music with an instrument that you had not been hip to before?
well, I was, you know, that piece when I was started having this calling for Australia,
Yeah.
as we talked about, and I was working on the music, and then I saw that movie, the early Peter Weir film, The Last Wave, and that's where I first heard the didgeridoo was in that movie.
Wow.
And
What year did that movie come out?
that was, you know, I can't answer that question, but I heard I probably in '85, I probably saw that movie, you know, at
Right.
that time. So so I was very aware of the instrument and of course drawn to it, but again, it was another one of these alluring, mysterious things, you know, and so before you know, by the time I went to Australia on my first trip, and I'm in Cairns in the Cape York area, in the Queensland area, in Cape York area, then I met up with David Hudson, who
Hmm.
is an Aboriginal master didgeridoo player, and I met him at one of his performances of his Aboriginal dance group. So I instantly just went right up to him and introduced myself and told him what I was there doing. And next thing you know, I'm recording him at his house and on a Sony Walkman cassette player, a Pro Walkman. And so and then that was the beginning of my connection to Didge directly with him. And he gave me a Didge and gave me a few little tips on it, but you know, it was nothing near like I'm able to play this thing. And then eventually he came actually to the US and he came to Tucson. And this is right when the whole early Didge explosion in Tucson was happening. And we
I just
actually,
want, I got to stop you right there because this is so classic. The early Didge explosion. So basically, you're talking like late 80s. I mean,
yes,
and why was there this explosion? I mean, it was obviously there was in the soundtrack you heard, but I mean, for me, this is classic. You're telling me that's when it hit. That's when it got into the old Pueblo.
right. It got into Tucson, and I know that story. Like I was there at
Now
the
you were
dump.
there. That's what I'm saying. You're right
Yeah,
there.
I mean, I was with Alan Shockley and
Oh
the
dear.
and then the Mark Woody. Okay, so let's say the didgeridoo, you know, of course, was starting to find its way into Western culture through some music and some. There was some bands at the time. Um, Outback, this band with from Australia that had this kind of, you know, it was more it was fun stuff and it was driving and rhythmic. I think it had a guitar, percussionist, and then Charlie McMahon was a didge player, and he was missing a hand, so he would play the didge holding the didge with a hook
Oh my God.
on
Wait,
his
would you
hand.
say this was like sort of Australian folk music, or how? What would the
Yeah, it was sort of it absolutely had like almost like a Celtic vibe to it, but it
right,
had more of
right.
like a early trance, you know, groove thing going on, but all acoustic, you know, no electronic stuff that I
Wow,
could remember.
wow.
So, I mean, these things were starting to seep into America, but when I went to Australia and came back and then you know, had the recordings of David that I used on Dreamtime, and then he was over here like I would say pretty quickly, like in '89. So Celestial Harmonies, who was based in Tucson, the record label was releasing a lot of world music at that time from all over the world. So I had introduced them to David's music, and the owner at that time said, "Who is going to want to hear a 60-minute CD of didgeridoo?" And I said, you will be surprised.
Yes.
And so we proceeded to record that first album ever on CD. I mean, I'm really not blowing my horn there, but there was no didgeridoo music on CD. And
Yes. No, I knew there was something seminal. So this is seminal stuff right here.
right. And so David happened to be in Tucson, and he was doing some sort of promotion traveling over here for his dance group or something. And then, so in my little house up Bear Canyon on the east side, I had a 8-track recorder. And so we set up and we recorded Walunda. You can find it in Amazon, wherever.
Wow.
And it's 10 solos for didgeridoo. And so we recorded that album in an afternoon. And then, Celestial ended up releasing the album. And at the same time, at that time in Tucson, there was a record store called Here's Music on Campbell, and it was like a CD store, and that's when CDs were like at the pinnacle of the whole, you know.
CDs were in.
So we did an in-store with David there, and then across the street was a guy, just happened to be in the area there, Don Campbell, I think his name is, and or Don Walter, and he was making at that time this whole piece. Simultaneously, this kind of zeitgeist was happening with this didgeridoo explosion, and the idea that you could make didgeridoos from agave stalks.
Wow.
And so those are not familiar with the agave cactus, it's basically you see the cactus that sprouts out, it looks like a massive artichoke, and then out of the center of that comes a stalk that could be, 15 feet tall. This stalk that comes out of the center of that of the agave cactus. So when the whole lifespan goes through its timeline, and then it falls over, and then somehow from my memory, it was a guy from New Mexico named Mark Woody that brought that idea through, and then he shared it with Alan Shockley, who's now passed away, but he was the legendary didge player and purveyor of all things agave stock didgeridoos in Tucson. And so
he was the one that was like, wow, we can make him out of that.
Yeah, and so, but yeah, he got, I think, Mark Woody from Santa Fe, and they teamed up, and so they started harvesting stalks all over southern Arizona. And so when when the agave stalk dries out, then you trim it at both ends, and then it dries out for maybe a year, and then you take an extendable drill bit that's going to maybe go 4 feet down on each side, and you bore out the soft core like balsa wood out of the shell of this long stalk. And then you continue to clean it up and dress it up and trim it, and then you coat it with this. It's an epoxy, but it's it seals non-toxic. And so these guys discovered all that, and then you put in a beeswax mouthpiece on it, and then you have an amazing sounding didgeridoo that's, compared to the Australian didgeridoo, it sounds like it's amplified because of the thinner walls of the agave stalk. So the didgeridoo is
you put the Never Ever Land on me right now. That's unbelievable.
So then and at that point, then, David Hudson, Australian Aboriginal Didge Master, was here. We recorded his album that same week. We went over, did an in-store at the music store. We met, the local didge maker, and Don, and then went over to his place, and David ended up buying 5 of his agave stock didges and took them back to Australia in 89. And that's, that was like a whole, just there it is, it's like you can see how things spread, around the world quickly. So
can you talk about, were you playing on the recording synthesizers, or because the 12 solos
the Walunda album, I mean, at that point I had been to Australia a couple times, and I was at Larrikin Records in Sydney, which was their sort of folkways label that we would see here, and they had a didgeridoo album Absolutely. And it was a master didge player and it was a 45 record, and that was it.
Wow.
In
Wow.
in 86, there was nothing on CD, and that's why when I came back and proposed that to Celestial, I said, we need this on CD. And so David proceeded to record that, and so it was solo. We did a few more albums together, Serpents, Rainbow Serpent, and I forget the names of the other albums actually, but they're collaborations. But the first album was 100% solo didgeridoo, and then I was also, treating it in a reverb space, so you had the sense you were in an acoustic environment, like you were in a small cave or something.
What I'm looking here, Steve Roach, David Hudson, Deep Didgeridoo, 1994. There's an interview with Kimberly Haas. But you had done stuff. Had there been stuff done before this one?
What was that date?
94.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
So there, yeah.
yeah, I mean, his first album came out in, I think, 89. And so that was in 94, you said?
Yeah, Deep Didgeridoo. I'm just looking here. Let's see. What's the name of the Australia Sound of the Earth?
Yeah, that was in 89. That's when I went back to Australia, and I went around the country recording either didgeridoo inspired artists, which included Sarah Hopkins, who was a very well-known musician in Queensland area, and her father was a conductor from New Zealand, but she played cello, and she played cello in a style that was called circular bowing. And she adopted that from playing with a lot of didge players in Darwin. She lived in Darwin at the top end of Australia. And so, she would play cello in a way that sounded like a didge, the way she would bow it. And so that's what that album was about. But that was before the first album of Walunda with David.
How do you spell Walunda, by the way?
Yep, Woolunda.
Okay, got it. Dude, I mean, so after that recording, I mean, did you start to see a lot more people now recording didgeridoo after that?
Well, it just, there were so many, that band also, I got to correct myself, Gondwanaland, that was the band with Charlie and McMahon, and who had the hook.
Oh man, yeah, that dude, man.
Yeah, I need to be correct on that because I'm rattling the memory cage here, but Outback was a band born of Western guys from America, I think. But Gondwanaland was, Charlie McMahon, and he was married to an Aboriginal woman, and I mean, he was the real deal, absolutely. And he also invented what I think was the inventor of what was called the didgebone, which is like a trombone, but it's a didgeridoo that's like made of probably PVC pipe, and you can play it and then slide it as you're playing it.
Oh, are you kidding? It has like different tones when you slide it.
Yeah, it'd be just like a trombone where it's gonna change the pitch as you're playing it.
Sure.
You could be playing in one key, and then you could set it up in a way to where you would then slide it down to the other key, or you could play it sliding it down in a glissando to the next pitch. So, but at that point, then it just absolutely blew up. I mean, didgeridoo was like the instrument for several years there. You couldn't go anywhere, in Tucson on a street fair, anywhere, and not hear didge, it was just like, and then what added to that was these big didge gatherings that would bring people in from all over, like 300 or 400 people, right into downtown Tucson at some of the art dance studios. And do you know the music of Stephen Kent?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, so he was in a band that really also was a Western group of guys called Lights in a Fat City. And he was a British guy, and we ended up doing an album together, Halcyon Days, but he's a master didge player. And so he would be part of these gatherings, of course, myself, and there would be, and Alan Shockley would organize these, but there would be, I mean, it was just a absolute, didgeridoo summit meeting, summit gathering with people jamming and then bands playing, but all, completely. I mean, if you didn't know any better, you would this is like the cult of the didgeridoo people or something.
I mean, it's a well, but it's not surprising considering it sort of the germ was here, and then everyone wanted to come to the place where, I mean, it was the biggest hotbed in the United States by far.
It was for didgeridoo, and I happened to be at here at the right place at the right time, also promoting the instrument in my way in the early 90s, the late 80s. And then it just so happened that Alan Shockley was here, and then they started, this whole agave didgeridoo thing. And then, the street fairs would always on 4th Avenue in Tucson would have like Rob Thomas from Inlakesh. He was another famous didge player.
Sure.
Of the instruments. And then of course, Serena, she discovered the instrument here in Tucson, and she came, she was going to the U of A back then. And then the didgeridoo early on became, an infatuation with her, as it did for us all. So she's been, just completely immersed in didgeridoo since the beginning here. And that was another piece that, brought us together was, when, we knew of each other in the community, but then just that piece, was another obvious connection to the music that we would then start to make. And so, but, that reminds me when we were speaking to, the music and how that's continued to evolve for me beyond synthesizers. And I was bringing in the work with Jorge and eventually Byron Metcalf, who's a, frame drum and percussion and all that. And then, just expanding the blending of the acoustic with the electric world, the synthetic world. And then, crossfade into the work I'm doing with Serena over the last few years, and her, mastery of, and just beautiful, language that she speaks through her instruments was just, another natural progression in exploring and blending, the power of acoustic instruments in this context of this music that, we're speaking of.
Can you just talk about what you're grateful for? Gratitude is the attitude, and I try to remind myself, for me, when it rains, it pours. In terms of getting inspiration or doing interviews, and then there are these periods where there's more ebbs, and not so much flowing. But through it all, I try to stay grateful. And I just wanted you to talk to the audience as we head into a new calendar year. How you find gratitude, what you find gratitude in your life.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful point here. It's a beautiful question, and it demands it demands
another part to this interview session so you can think about it for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's the gratitude and grace of the abundance that we have in our lives on so many levels is just can never, it's easy. Obviously, all of us, we take things for granted at times, and maybe more times than often, more times than not. But I mean, it's just the gifts that we have, just, from a materialistic point of view, is just completely off the chart. I mean, it's too much, really.
Right.
So,
yeah,
through that, you have to keep reeling it back in and keep connected to what is really important and what is really, you know, what's going to sustain your gratitude and your bliss, and, you know, the endless source of choices and options and gear and instruments and stuff to watch and things to track down on your phone and all of that sort of thing. And it's, you know, it's, to me, it's not about being of any particular age or shaking your cane at the sky about whatever, you know, is now here and wasn't this way years ago, because there's always levels of new information and new options and new things to take your attention away from the grace and gratitude that you can wake up to every day and just start from a clean slate of that. I have to tell myself every day, that's such a discipline to stay connected with the pure essence of the clean slate, you know,
Oh man, I love it, man. No, I mean it's
the tabula rasa, man. I mean, it's,
I
you
mean,
know,
it's funny because I just interviewed the great drummer again, Jim Keltner for they're trying to sell a picture of the concert for Bangladesh that George
incredible,
Harrison put on. Raise
incredible,
money,
man.
raise money for a food kitchen, not a food kitchen, a big operation to feed the homeless called Food Forward. And you know, I just feel like Keltner was talking a lot about you know meeting John Lennon, recording, meeting George Harrison, and he just said that you know I'm not going to do this justice, but for all the sort of most consequential issues in life, love really is the answer, and to me that has to do with just being vulnerable, to being putting yourself in vulnerable positions and hoping that other cats will meet you halfway, and in that sense, you're preserving the integrity of mankind and the world, and I that's what I try to do, to just want to see more of it, and that so it's just important that you continue. And I mean, I think you were, you give your love in many ways, but I just think that being able to keep your heart open and recognizing that there are many chapters left, but that love is the most important thing. I mean, that's what that concert was. George did that for Ravi. He was his student.
Mm.
So it's just like and some people say, "Oh yeah, man, great love, yeah, whatever, okay, whatever," But like, I just know that it can't just be some callous, sort of litmus test, purity test to prove that you are in line with spirit or source. It has to do. There has to be a component of love as well. It's not just. It's not just reading things out of the Bible. I mean, that's. I think that was what Keltner basically said, is he learned that from George. So there has to be some kind of balance between, like you said, having that discipline, being grateful, but also recognizing that doors are opening for you, and you do want to walk through them with your toys and with your machines and with your creativity, and there's nothing wrong with that either.
But you go in there with humility and
That's
grace
right.
and gratitude. And I mean, every day, every year now, I mean, that word love is more important than ever. And vulnerability, is the place that really I've been living at since I made the choice to step out into this world of what I felt a calling, what I feel such a deep calling to create. There was nothing really to compare it to. I mean, there was these things we spoke of, the European influences, the German stuff and all that. But at a certain point, you're completely, alone, and you're vulnerable, and you're just, sitting there praying into the unknown and reaching into the unknown. And then you're pulling out these expressions of the deepest and the altus place, the highest and deepest part of yourself. And so, that's what I'm here to do every day, every night. I mean, every moment. And it's like the constant challenge is to try and stay balanced with life, with just the day-to-day aspects of life, and not get, um, you know,
Totally, man. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. The
so.
most mundane things just go by the wayside because you're just so deep in the process of creation from
So
that
I'm
place.
really, yeah, and I still try to, like, you know, reel it in a bit and say, just let's go do some mundane things. Let's do some
Hmm.
things around the house or clean this stuff up or whatever, and do the kind of service for the soul, to where you can have that sense of gratitude and reflection and appreciation. Because I came from really, my family was, my dad was a working class, missile mechanic for General Dynamics in San Diego. I mean, he was working on fuselages for missiles,
Jeez.
but he was bucking rivets, and he was, a working class guy, and worked for 40 years and didn't miss a day's work. And I got a lot of that from him, that kind of, um,
No,
get
just
up.
because he wasn't in the ivory tower didn't mean he had a brilliant,
No, he was, I mean, he had so much feeling and so much emotion, and he
oh,
didn't,
that is sick. Yeah,
he didn't
he was a tough,
express it,
yeah, totally.
he didn't express it through his work, but he expressed it in his relationships with his friends. And I just would see it in his eyes, and feel that through his soul. And I
Hmm.
got so much of that from him. And he would often well up with tears of emotion over things. And I just love that he gave that to me. And he also gave me the discipline to get up every day and just go for it. And so that's still alive, more than ever in me. So.
Steve Roach, I'm gonna be coming to the January 3rd concert. I was hoping maybe if possible, I could in advance of I could come in a little bit early. We could do maybe a video interview to promote the show. If that works for your time frame, we can worry about that later. But I wanted to just say to you, um, how grateful I am that our paths have crossed, and you're an important anchor. You will be an important anchor for me as I move forward in my own life. So many blessings to you, man. I really this was a great hang.
Oh yeah, Jake, this is just been waiting years to have these conversations. And
No,
so,
man.
yeah, I mean, ambient lounge. I mean,
And dude, ambient lounge is on, man. Century room, baby.
so that's, on a side note there, this really worked out great, because I had the No Zone Like Home event in Tucson. And then on Saturday, and then the next day, we had two sold out shows with myself and Serena Gabriel and Jeff Granke, another ambient artist based in Tucson who's been around forever.
Sure.
And then, the whole situation there was so cool. And we started talking with Arthur Vent, who runs the place. And he's,
Legendary cat, man. Yeah, no.
man,
Yeah.
running the Village Vanguard for 10 years. And we've got this absolutely completely cool venue there, right at the Hotel Congress. So
Unbelievably hip place. I mean, I've been there a couple times. It's just anyway, I
yeah,
can't wait. But to see you guys is going to be
yeah,
this isn't Dixieland trad music. This is a freaking mind melting excursion into the intergalactic.
yeah. And it's really taking that context of deep sacred listening, which is what, the beautiful jazz churches, i.e. venues, are on the planet. And then bringing in this quality of music, which is, it's a lateral move into deep listening. And it's been a dream of mine since the 90s in Tucson to have such a experience. So we're going to have monthly events there now, the first Tuesday in every month ongoing.
Oh my God, man, that I mean, John Coltrane. There were cats that saw him get it on stage, start beating his chest. It is about deep listening. It's also about accessing the primordial gut. And there's nothing wrong with having discarga during Steve Roach shows, man. I mean, that's really what it's about.
I am all for that, man.
Yeah, man.
I'm going to
Seriously,
take that.
listen. Let's just stay in touch. We'll. Uh, but I'm gonna hit the road with my kids, and we're gonna take a road trip to to Idaho for about 12 days, but when I come on back, we're right around the corner from the Century Room, so we'll do it up.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see you there.
Many blessings, dude.
Thank you, Jake.
Take care, brother.
Great,
All right.
great day.
Take
Blessings,
care.
love.
Love.